Hello then, good afternoon ladies and gentlemen, this is Al24 World News. I'm Abdurrahim Kashur and to the headlines. US President Joe Biden arrives in Brussels aboard the Presidential Air Force One ahead of NATO, G7 and EU summits. The World Health Organization says it has documented 64 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine. The 64th U.S. Secretary of State and the first woman to ever serve this role, Madeleine Albright, has died at the age of 84 due to cancer. Starting our news bulletin with the latest updates over the Ukraine-Russia conflict. The use of chemical weapons by Russia in Ukraine could contaminate NATO Territory Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warns as the alliance meets in Brussels. US President Joe Biden is in Brussels for NATO, G7 and EU summits. He is expected to unveil further sanctions against Russia. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky calls for global protests to demand an end to the Russian invasion. He also calls for NATO to provide effective and restricted aid for Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow plans to sell its gas to unfriendly countries in rubles. Fighting between Russia and Ukrainian forces is still witnessing its highest degree of rage as bombardments in the capital Kiev is still being heard and blasts. These devastated buildings can still raise their smoke. Ukrainian forces on the other side could retake various towns around the capital Kiev and could fly the Ukrainian flag on the tops of the roofs of many southern and western regions. Osama Yadi.
As battles rage in towns around the Ukrainian capital Kyiv, Russian forces continue their bombardment on towns near the city, which has been besieged for days.
Feeling is difficult, very difficult, because anyone who wants that heat in their city.
According to reports, many territories were retaken by Ukrainian forces around the capital Kyiv. Ukrainian army retook control of several regions, including Makariv. After a tough struggle, Ukrainian Defense Ministry stated that it had recaptured Makariv, which they said was a strategically vital town west of Kyiv, and they had once again flown the Ukrainian flag.
They fire mortars, grads, Sushki guns and tanks. The locals help us a lot. We're constantly digging, we're fortifying, we're holding our own, we're on our own ground. We are under constant bombardment, heavy artillery, tanks, Sushki self-propelled guns. They are using 120 caliber. They're bombing civilian targets too.
According to Ukrainian Defense Ministry, forces could take control again of the city of Izium, thanks to a fierce battle against the Russian forces. These movements of the Ukrainian army could afford some relief against the siege imposed by Russian army, which took control of Izium 2 weeks ago. U.S. Defense Ministry spokesman also stated that the Ukrainians were also reversing momentum in some parts of the south, as Russian forces were pushed back in and an armored convoy was destroyed.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a meeting in Moscow with Peter Maurer, president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, while the summit in Brussels is ongoing. The meeting came 1 month after Russia launched its military operation in Ukraine. At an extraordinary summit in Brussels, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says that the alliance must stress its defenses in the east and the context of the Russian operation in Ukraine. Jens added that Russian President Vladimir Putin made a big mistake with his special military operation in Ukraine, whose resistance he underestimated. Let's have a listen.
We have increased our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance. The NATO leaders will today address the need for a reset of our deterrence and defense in the longer term. Putin has made a big mistake, and that is to launch a war, to wage war against an independent sovereign nation. He has underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian people, the bravery of the Ukrainian people and the armed forces.
US President Joe Biden arrives in Brussels aboard the Presidential Air Force One, where he is greeted by Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. Joe Biden is in Europe to unite the unity among Western whose options for retaliation against Russia are shrinking as the Russian special military operation in Ukraine continues. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Wednesday said in a statement that Biden administration has determined that Russian forces have committed war crimes in Ukraine and said it would work with others to prosecute offenders. U.S. State Department's Goodwill Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice, Beth Van Schaak, told News Conference. Let's have a listen.
Last week, Secretary Blinken expressed his view that some of Russia's reported attacks did in fact constitute war crimes. He emphasized that the Department of State and other U.S. departments will be documenting and assessing the facts and the law surrounding these reports. The assessment has now concluded with a careful review of currently available information, both public and from intelligence sources. This review underpins the assessment that the Secretary announced today, that Russian forces are indeed committing war crimes in Ukraine.
Same line of thought since Russia started its military operation in Ukraine. A month ago, the World Health Organization says it has documented 64 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine. Russian forces shelling was verified to have occurred at the rate of 2 to 3 per day, February 24th and March 21st, killing at least 15 individuals. Sofian Kachori.
Ukraine has accused Russia of bombing hospitals and health facilities, including a children's and maternity hospital, in the besieged city of Mariupol in what one city officials called a war crime without justification. Nearly 4 million people have been forced to flee the country, according to the UN, with Ukraine putting up fierce resistance in the face of the Russian advance. Cities including Kharkiv, Kiev and Mariupol have come under intense aerial shelling, with people forced into underground shelters for safety.
I don't like to be a Cassandra, but the problems we've faced so far, collectively, and with great credit to the surrounding countries, are really the tip of an iceberg of need. And there's going to have to be a further massive scaling up of assistance within Ukraine in the coming weeks, because I have never myself seen such complex needs so quickly in a crisis that has developed so fast.
On Wednesday, the United States said it had determined that Russia committed war crimes in Ukraine, such as shelling of Mariupol and the attack on the maternity hospital. The 4-week operation has also forced Ukraine to repurpose hospitals to care for wounded, disrupting the provision of basic medical services to the rest of the population. The World Health Organization noted that nearly 1,000 health facilities are close to the front lines or in areas of occupation.
Russia is intensifying its military operation in the capital Kiev. More and more are fleeing the region to seek shelter in western Ukraine cities like Lviv. For many Ukrainians fleeing the horror of this operation, the city of Lviv is the last destination toward a new future outside the country. Hassan Burkan has more to tell.
About 70 kilometers from the border with Poland, Lviv in Ukraine has become the main transit point for all those fleeing the special military operation. Located in the western part of the country, the city has largely been untouched by the Russians' operations. Many displaced Ukrainians share their story and why they are leaving.
Because everyone wants to go to the train, and men push, and men say that I want to go. My kids are in the train already, and people say no, first women and kids. Now I see many people who are walking and crying.
It is not just the fear of death. Many are leaving because they don't want to continue without education for their children and jobs for them.
I left not because I was afraid. I'd love to protect, maybe to take part in protection, but somebody have to get job and earn some money.
Trains arrive at all hours. People come from Sumy, Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol, Odessa, and Chernihiv. Sometimes they arrive in their cars when railways connections have been interrupted.
We're going to Lviv. We're actually from Lviv. from the western part of Ukraine. We live in Kyiv for 10 years.
But
we left our home to go back to my grandparents.
The United Nations High Commission for Refugees stated that 10 million people have now fled their homes in Ukraine because of the Russian special military operation, as well as the 3.6 million who have left for neighboring countries.
In the same story, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky urged citizens around the world to take the streets and protest against war in his country. He asked the world to show solidarity with Ukraine. Meanwhile, protesters gathered at the Grand Central Station in Manhattan to show solidarity with Ukraine.
Show your standing. Come from your offices, your homes, your schools and universities. Come in the name of peace. Come with Ukrainian symbols to support Ukraine, to support freedom, to support life. Come to your squares, your streets. Make yourselves visible and heard. Say that people matter, freedom matters, peace matters, Ukraine matters. Russia started the war against freedom as it is. This is only the beginning for Russia on the Ukrainian land. Russia is trying to defeat the freedom of all people in Europe, of all the people in the world. It tries to show that only crude and cruel force matters.
Also, Vladimir Zelensky in an open-air speech in the street said that we expect meaningful actions from NATO, the EU and the G7. He also pleads with the Russian people, saying that when we have succeeded, your children will no longer be sent to die on our earth.
We expect significant action from NATO, the EU and the G7. We know that the Russians have already started to put pressure on their interests. Those are the interests of war. We know they are working with some partners. We know they want to promote this issue, the fight against war, but it is the war that must be put forward.
President Vladimir Putin declared that Russia will seek payment in rubles for gas sales from unfriendly countries. The country will refuse to accept payment for natural gas supplies in compromised currencies, including the dollar and the euro, and will move to payments in rubles. Let's have a listen.
It is clear that in this context it makes no sense for us to supply our goods to both the European Union and receive payments in dollars, euros or other currencies. So I decided in a very short time to implement a series of transfer payment measures. We will start by transferring Russian rebels payments for our supplies of natural gas to so-called hostile countries. This means giving up in all regulations to currencies that have been compromised. At the same time, I would like to emphasize separately that Russia will continue to supply conditional natural gas in accordance with the volumes and the pricing principles defined in the contracts concluded before.
Olaf Scholz said on Wednesday that the Russian offensive in Ukraine is getting bogged down despite all the destruction it causes day after day. Scholz also stated that war destroys Ukraine, but they are waging war. Putin also destroys the future of Russia, before the Bundestag assuring that Kiev could count on the help from Germany.
It is with great courage and perseverance that the citizens of Ukraine are fighting for their homeland. Putin's offensive is bogged down despite all the destruction it causes day after day. And we, together with all our friends and partners, let's stay united.
To a different matter now, South Korea and Japan's military said that North Korea launched what may be a long-range ballistic missile off its east coast Thursday, in what appeared to be its first test launch since an air-to-air missile was reported to explode over Pyongyang last week. South Korea's Joint Chief of Staff stated that they had detected the launch of an unspecified projectile from North Korea, believed to be a long-range missile and possibly an ICBM launched on the high trajectory. According to Madeleine Albrighty family, the 64th U.S. Secretary of State and the first woman to ever serve this role, died at the age of 84 due to cancer. A statement posted to her Twitter page by her relatives who wrote she died on Wednesday surrounded by family and friends. Islam Seed on What's Follow.
Former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, the first woman to hold this position in the U.S. government, died on Wednesday at the age of 84. Madeleine Albright was born on May 15, 1937 in Prague from a Jewish family. 11 years later, her family moved to the United States, where she reached the highest levels of power thanks to her hard work and brilliant studies. She served as a head of diplomacy between 1997 and 2001 in the administration of Democratic President Bill Clinton. Just before taking the lead in the American diplomacy, she held the post of U.S. ambassador to the United Nations from 1993 to 1997, where she made her mark notably during the U.S. offensive in Kosovo. American diplomacy spokesman Ned Price called her that devastating. He described her as a pioneer and a role model who paved the way for much of their profession.
Of course, she was a trailblazer as the first female Secretary of State, and quite literally opened doors for a large element of our workforce. It's a really devastating piece of news. I know there are many people in this building who are grieving and who will be grieving today, and our thoughts, of course, are with her family.
The UN Security Council held a minute of silence in memory of her 4-year representative to the United Nations and was seen as a passionate voice for freedom and democracy. Madeleine Albright died of cancer, according to her relatives, who saluted her as a tireless defender of democracy and human rights.
The African continent now, according to Somalian police, 2 gunmen attacked Mogadishu's tightly guarded international airport, killing at least 6 people. Somali native and 5 foreigners are among the dead. The police spokesperson Major Al-Vitah Adan Hassan said 2 gunmen were killed by security troops. According to witnesses and family, a young female politician was killed by a suicide bomber in the city of Beledweyne, around 300 kilometers north of Mogadishu. Amina Mohammed, an outspoken opponent of the government, renowned for her impassioned speeches, was assassinated as she came near the facility holding Hirabash state authorities in Somalia. A jailed Corsican nationalist whose prison assault sparked protest on the French Mediterranean island has died. Yavan Colonna, 61, who was serving a life term for murdering Costa Rica's top official, was beaten by another inmate, a Colombian jihadist, on the 2nd March. The attack left Colonna in a coma, and he had been receiving treatment in hospital in the south of France. Moderna announced that it will ask for permission from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to use COVID-19 vaccine for children. The company said that it requested it based on interim results from its clinical trial that showed even with the given a dose that was 1/4 as strong as the adult dose, these youngest children had an immune or an imminent response that was similar to young adults. More international news in this roundup by Zahra Furjani.
Drones, rescuers and thermal cameras are mobilized Thursday in China at the site where a plane carrying 132 people crashed. The search is doubling down to locate hypothetical survivors and the second black box. 4 days after the tragedy, no survivor has yet to be found. Singapore is lifting restrictions for all travelers vaccinated from next week, announces Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, by welcoming a major step for the air hub in its strategy of coexistence with COVID.
Arrivals from abroad constitute only a very small proportion of cases. We can therefore safely open up our borders.
COVID is making its latest comeback in parts of the northeastern United States as the BA.2 coronavirus variant becomes dominant in the country, while urging Congress to pass new funding or risk the supply of future treatments and vaccines.
But we need Congress to act and provide $22.5 billion in immediate emergency funding so we can execute on the plan, so we can be prepared for whatever comes next.
For the first time in Colombia, two Afro-descendants will compete for vice presidency. Francia Marquez, a 40-year-old lawyer, and Luis Gilberto Murillo, a 55-year-old engineer, are both environmental activists and represent some of the poorest and most violence-encircled regions of this country of 50 million inhabitants. Nominees in the short and feature documentary categories at the 2022 Oscars gather Wednesday night for reception and screening at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in Beverly Hills.
Sport now. The Algerian national team held its second training session yesterday in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea, and now the selection is about to fly to Cameroon for the first match of the qualifying round for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. This Friday at Jabouma Stadium, the stadium which the Algerian national team and its fans suffered from its experience during the last AFCON 2021. And now let's have a reminder for our main top stories. US President Joe Biden arrives in Brussels aboard the Presidential Air Force One ahead of NATO, G7 and EU summits. The World Health Organization says it has documented 64 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine. The 64th U.S. Secretary of State and the first woman to ever serve this role, Madalena Albright, has died at the age of 84 due to cancer. That's all the news we have got so far. Stay tuned for further information. Bye-bye.